Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are now about to begin a panel on reviving trust and resilience in our institutions. Please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box under the chat. The moderator will take them at the end, time permitting. I will now hand things off to our moderator, Michael Casey. Thank you.
Hello there. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Casey. I'm the Chief Content Officer at CoinDesk. It's a pleasure, as it always is, to work with my good friends at the GBBC. Done a lot of work with them over the years, and they really have one of the sort of the finest sets of programming around the future of blockchain technology and its implications for the world. So, as always, very happy to be here, and I have got a true all-star panel to join me in discussing what is ultimately a huge topic. We're dealing with this question of trust. For those of us who've been involved in the blockchain world, we know how much that word really matters to what this technology is all about. What we're doing here is we're sort of exploring the real world problem of trust, the trust in institutions, and framing it in the context of course, this most dramatic of years with the COVID crisis really challenging the way that societies organize themselves and tackle big problems in a collective way. So we're going to look at, what problems we see, but we're also going to look into what can be done with the decentralizing technology such as blockchain to tackle a better way for us to deal with this trust deficit that we're seeing in so many of our institutions. Joining me, I'm going to quickly list them and then we'll just get started. But first of all, Alan Cohn, who is a partner at Steptoe and Johnson. Hello, Alan. We have Nasia Seria, General Manager from MTN. Hi, Nasia.
Hi, everyone.
Jeff Saviano, Global Tax Innovation Leader from Ernst & Young.
Michael.
And Jim Newsom, Founding Partner of Delta Strategy Group and the former Chair of the US CFTC. And last but definitely not least, the man who's everywhere, Bill Tai, founder of ActTai and a key contributor to the GBBC and other aspects of this community. So welcome, gentlemen and ladies. Thank you so much for doing this. First of all, Bill, I thought I was just going to throw to you because, what I think would be really useful here, we're going to hear and talk about trust and resilience and the systems and institutions that we're grappling with. Can you frame why, a blockchain model, a decentralized system like blockchain is relevant to this core problem of trust and the sense of failure that some people feel in existing centralized institutions?
Yeah, sure. I have a background mostly in hard technology and silicon and communication systems previously, and I liken it actually to the evolution of communications networks. And if you think about the way humans have existed for a long, long time in sort of physically localized tribes, if you clock back 200 or 300 years ago, you'd basically be born and raised in the same town that you were ever to be in. And over time, as society got more mobile, each of the nodes, the people in those towns, were able to migrate to wherever they needed to go to bring their talent to where it could be best applied. Communication systems, in a way, were not that different. If you think about just 20 years ago, there were a variety of communications networks that didn't talk to each other. They were like little islands, whether it was a Unix network or a Stanford University Unix, Sun came out of that, or Novell networks, or CompuServe, Prodigy, whatever. You had your own little tribe that you communicated with, and that gave you implicit trust because you kind of knew who everybody was in a smaller community, just like you'd know people in your town, and there was more accountability. And as the information that was being communicated started to value across different networks, you needed to have ways to allow the information to flow across heterogeneous networks. So things would come across through a Cisco router that would be a translation layer, multi-protocol router that allowed Unix to talk to Novell, talk to TCP/IP. So here we are now as humans on that node communicating ideas, thoughts, information that looks interesting, but you don't know how to authenticate its source. And then you have, countries like Russia practicing disinformation just to confuse everybody. So as we move to a more heterogeneous capability of humans to interact with each other across this very wide fabric of the world, there needs to be sort of a reference layer that allows the trust to be implicit. And, it used to come from brands. If you were a news agency, the big company name gave you that sort of social credibility. Now comes from this node, loose node, wild free radical node, broadcasting with their iPhone from some country. So I think, we just have to have this fabric of identity and authentication and ways to, in a virtual way, identify that source.
Yeah, I think that's a really we're talking about here that we've relied upon them is now fragmented, where information comes from all sources. We have decentralized our information architecture, but what we haven't done is create framework for how we take whatever valuable information,
I wonder while we're waiting.
Hi, I believe we've lost Michael. Jeff, please continue.
I wonder while we're waiting for Michael and Bill, I really appreciate your comments. I think that correlation that you mentioned is so important. And one of the areas that we have been so interested in with blockchain is the connection to tax and fiscal systems, and how important when we look at trust and we look at the government citizen experience. And just to focus on that for a minute, perhaps you can't find a relationship where trust has been lacking more than the tax authority, the tax man, and the taxpayer. And when we look at the importance of taxation and fiscal systems and blockchain, this has been really interesting to us. Let me just give a few statistics while we wait for Michael to come back. And this comes from the UN, and in 39 of the world's 75 poorest countries, they don't have the basic finance functions, let alone additional investment that's needed to meet the SDGs. So 39 of the world's 75 poorest countries, they don't have enough revenue to meet the basic state functions. That's point number one. Point number two, also based on some UN research, achieving the SDGs in the 59 lowest income developing countries would require new capital on average of about $400 billion a year. So 59, the bottom 59 countries, in order to meet the SDGs, you need $400 billion a year. Every year we lose $3 trillion to tax fraud. That's fraudulent, corrupt activities. Just think about that. Only 13%, if we can recover 13% of all of tax fraud that occurs in the world, we can fund the SDGs in the 59 poorest countries in the world. Blockchain, for the reasons that Bill has started us off thinking about today, blockchain is an incredible solution to provide the transparency and perhaps a substitute where the trust isn't there in the world. So I thought, Michael, perhaps that could be an early statistic to throw out of the importance of blockchain and to taxation and fiscal systems, because money makes the world go around, and 13% of lost tax fraud funding 59 countries, I think, is incredible.
Yeah, and I apologize for my brief departure there. Not sure what happened, but hopefully back with more stable internet connection now. Thanks for that, Jeff. And I think it's a really important way to again, focus on the most important institution of all, in which this trust challenge exists. If you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's actually had an increase in trust in government. in the last in May during the middle of the crisis, but really still very, very low. And I think that sort of deficit around tax and its usages is a key part of that. But I want to frame the conversation just briefly now around COVID, and I think that's where the responses to that are being tested. And as I was saying, I'm not sure at what point I was cut off, but essentially it is also a decentralizing force in the way that Bill's described this decentralized digital architecture. The pandemic is a decentralizing force, and so how do we respond to that? Through these centralized institutions, which in many cases have failed. Alan, I thought I'd throw to you on this because I think you've framed this a little bit in terms of emergency responses. How is it that we could bring a decentralized approach to something like this pandemic?
No, thanks, Michael. And it's a really good question, and the pandemic provides a really good example and case study of how technologies that enable decentralization are really critical to solving key problems. So, as was noted, I'm a partner at a law firm now, co-chair our blockchain practice. But before that, I was an assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security, and spent 15 years before that working in emergency services and emergency management. And what we seem to be facing now in terms of responding to this pandemic is a crisis of confidence, which is a function both of the actions of government and others, but also the trust. And in an emergency, once there's some indication of the slippage in confidence, then the public begins to mistrust everything. Individuals responding begin to distrust everything, whether that's good news or bad. So emergency management, whether it's about a time-limited event like a hurricane or an earthquake, or like today's pandemic, is inherently decentralized. There are different actors just in the United States, at the local, at the state, at the federal level, in the private sector, in the public sector, having to act very much at the tactical level, and at the operational coordination levels, and at the strategic or policy level. And they have to act in a coordinated but ultimately decentralized manner. The event is just too big for a single entity to manage. So what do you need to enable that? Well, you need transparency, you need accountability, you need public engagement. And so technologies that enable that kind of trust and decentralization are of obvious benefit to government in these situations. Touching on not only the ways in which governments can coordinate with each other, but what Jeff noted, this government and to citizen experience. So whether that's technologies that can verify medical credentials, or the safety of vaccine trials, or the authenticity and certification of personal protective equipment, all the way up to systems that enable exchange and validation of both information and value of all sorts, as all types of geographically dispersed activity is taking place. Kind of what Bill was referencing as that reference layer enables the kind of decentralized activity that animates really the best types of emergency management. As somebody noted, there's inherent resilience in well-designed decentralized systems. That's the case in physical systems, particularly with respect to emergency management, as much as it is in.
Great, thanks, Alan. So, Jim, I thought I'd throw to you here, since we're on the topic of governments and how they're handling things. I mean, this crisis has not only been one that has tested healthcare systems, but dramatic challenges to the financial system. A big shortage of dollars, breakdown in supply chains, which has its own economic impact, and then obviously the need to distribute welfare and stimulus checks and all this sort of stuff. A massive challenge there. You spent all those years at the CFTC. How do you see and frame, first of all, the challenge of this trust in institutions like the ones you led, if that's indeed the case, and how blockchain technology can help revive that trust and the effectiveness, as institutions have to manage crises like this one?
Well, thank you, Michael. It's always good to work with you, and having the opportunity to participate with Bill and Alan. We've done so many times, and now Jeff and Nasia. It's nice to meet you and have a chance to participate with you guys as well. when we talk about institutional trust, it is a big topic, and Bill mentioned that on one of our first conversations as a panel. And you can look at it from the institutional standpoint, and of course that includes private and public sectors. We all know, and we've talked about it many, many times, the capability and advantages of this technology and how it can help us across so many areas, whether it's tax, emergency, or et cetera. But I think in the financial services sector specifically, the government is just not allowing us to get to the point where we can really utilize the tools that this technology is offering us. And when you talk about trust, you can look at it in a number of aspects. But in financial services, our biggest enemy is uncertainty. And I think uncertainty leads to distrust. And when you look at the regulatory components around the acceptance, the government acceptance of the technology that we're all so supportive of, there's too much uncertainty. And I think whether it's from the SEC or the CFTC, the executive branch or the legislative branch, we've got the tools in place to build this trust and to get to a point where we've got the certainty that we need to utilize more of this technology in a very effective manner. But right now, too much uncertainty exists because of the lack of the regulatory process. I mean, in a typical rulemaking, this proposal is put out for the public. The public has an opportunity to look at it, comment on it. It's a very transparent process. But the system that most of the government, at least in the U.S., is utilizing is not that transparent process. It's really rule development through enforcement. And the SEC had an announcement yesterday, and SEC Commissioner Mr. Pierce, put out a comment in which she dissented, not necessarily because of the activity of the company, but because it was another step of developing rules through enforcement, and she doesn't think that's the proper way to do it. Neither do I, and I think most people on this panel would agree that enforcement is not the right approach. It leads to more uncertainty, and we've got to create certainty and trust throughout the government if we're going to be able to move forward and utilize this technology to its full capabilities.
So it's another excellent point. I mean, in an environment where the technology is changing so rapidly, and we don't even really know, necessarily how it will fit within the framework of existing laws, it seems like a really ad hoc way to be grappling with the development of whatever the framework should be. But let's flip it. What may be actually a positive take on this? Nasia, you're there in South Africa, so you have a view of how I suppose blockchain, but also mobile telephone technology has come into bear in it's such an integral part of payments now across many parts of Africa. And I think you've seen impact on actually in a positive sense, perhaps, in terms of accountability and the like. Can you shed some light on that, please?
Yes, that's correct. Thanks again, and thanks to the GBBC for having such a great session. I was listening in on a lot of the other panels earlier today. So yeah, down here in Africa, the debates are a little different, but very similar in terms of the issues, just maybe in a different context. So as you'd be aware, we have a very growing population across the continent. We also have the youngest population in the world, and we have tons of development issues and challenges, right? And so therefore, there's very little trust in our public institutions, in our private institutions as well. And one way to obviously to bridge this gap is through the leapfrogging of technologies that we see taking place. So whether it may be through mobile money, which is the space that I work in, crypto is actually got a very large uptake across the continent as well. International remittances is huge. People just have to find ways to get things done, to sort of go about their daily business, whether it's through the informal sectors without kind of going through your formal institutions. So blockchain plays a huge role. I mean, digital identity, the ability, as Bill said, to authenticate. I mean, for us to to actually think about having, for example, an election where you can use a voting app and you're already authenticated. That would take away huge political issues across our continent. So, so on the one hand, there's a lot of opportunity. On the other hand, exactly as James said, sometimes with the enforcement side of regulators, it does become a bit of a challenge in terms of advocating and understanding that the decentralized this is a tool that creates more trust and obviously revives the trust where it's lacking in some areas of our leadership across our various institutions in Africa.
Great. So we've tended to focus, I think, on the government part of the institutions here, but businesses play a critical role as well. And, I think the design of business activity, the design also very importantly of supply chains, has come into focus quite a bit through this crisis. One of the terms that's attached to the title of this session is reviving not just trust, but resilience in our institutions. And if you think about what I think one of the biggest challenges we faced with this crisis was the resilience of supply chains, specifically around things like PPE and medical wares, where we had very efficient just-in-time inventory for anything that we wanted anywhere in the world. The click of a button on Amazon, well designed for efficiency, but the system was not designed for a crisis when you needed to have a backup, a resilient backup of everything that was there. A just-in-time system is often just it's a centrally controlled, managed, point-to-point thing. I'd like maybe, Bill, you to talk a little bit about how the management of the economy itself across multiple entities could be better managed with a more open system that builds resiliency into its underlying framework. You're on mute, I think, Bill. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, going back to the analogy of sort of closed networks that didn't previously communicate to each other until there was a little translation there. When I look at the way businesses are organized and the amount of inventory, and I think it was Jeff, were you talking about sort of, or Alan, about authenticating PPE and medical equipment in supply chain? Yeah. So in non-medical, but like regular commercial businesses, if you look at what has been tremendous inefficiency in inventory and working capital, and I'll use an example of retail. So if you look at a Sears or a JCPenney versus a Walmart, the older model of retail basically built resiliency in by tying up a lot of working capital into inventory piles so that things could be moved to where they needed to go when they needed to be there. But over time, with the ability of digital and the ability to create a digital twin, so to speak, of the model of a commercial business, companies like Walmart were basically able to create real-time inventory systems where the resiliency was built into the system, not in piles of cash in the form of inventory. And if you look at it directionally at where our economy is going already in real practice, if you think about both housing and or transportation, there used to be lots and lots of unused dead cars in black car fleets or at homes that are now connected to a data science cloud called Uber, or Airbnb, same thing, empty rooms. They're basically, rooms on the endpoints of a data science cloud in Airbnb, as Walmart sort of had everything as a model that connected to the point of sale. So I think over time, what we're seeing is that you're going to have the survival of the companies that are efficient, and the ones that were inefficient, like Sears and JCPenney, they're gone. So by definition, we're going to be left with a world where the companies that are better performing, return on assets, return on capital, they're going to be the survivors that are basically digital twins of their systems, and there will be an ability to interconnect those systems in the same way that networks were connected 20 years ago. So I think it's going to happen, and blockchain is one expression that is like what the TCP/IP layer is to communications riding on top of it. Everything physical digital assets can have an identifier like an email address or whatever it is, the proxy for that sits on this very contiguous mesh network that allows everything to know where everything is at any time. So it's happening.
But now look at what's, if I could, Michael, look at what's happened with now when crisis places stress on that system. Now we have arguments that stem from these closed systems. How does a hospital acquire PPE? How does a state acquire PPE? How does a national stockpile get distributed? Now, all of a sudden, there needs to be more participants in the reference layer, and there needs to be more trust in the reference layer across more entities. And our systems are just not designed to work in that way right now. And so we have a dual breakdown. We get a breakdown in the actual distribution of physical items, and we have a breakdown in trust among participants in a broader kind of ecosystem that needs to come together at a moment of crisis.
Yeah, critical question. I want to get to the question of how do we get people to develop trust in this new way of thinking. I think that's a really important point. But I'd like you to weigh in as well, Jeff, on this question. I think you've done, from that perch at EY, you've seen how companies manage end-to-end inventory and supply. Where do you see it going?
I'm glad you brought us back to the private sector, Michael. And what we find really interesting is that there can be improvements to the customer experience and how important that is. But oftentimes, I feel as though we design business strategies for when things will go well. We assume that things will go according to plan. We design a strategy and an operating plan, and all of the processes are built on what happens in that process when everything goes according to plan. That's not life, and that's not business. And I think what's so interesting about the application of blockchain is that it's so effective when things don't go well. When you have a discrepancy in an order, when you have a complicated supply chain with multiple parties, and there's countless emails and still phone calls and very analog methods to resolve problems and discrepancies in the system. And this is an opportunity to clean that up. And I just think oftentimes we look at what's our system when things are going well, but we should also think about that's not business. Business is about problems, and it's about problem resolution, and blockchain can be quite effective there. I want to mention one other point about customer experience and the opportunity to use data once. Use it once, use it. This applies in the government application too, right? There's nothing more that erodes trust in citizens when you have 11 governmental agencies all looking for the same information. The same applies in complex supply chains in the private sector too. What an incredible opportunity to have a single version of that truth of data that can be used for multiple purposes and accessed in a very safe and secure way. And I loved how there was a great interview with President Ilves, former President Ilves of Estonia. And I think we've all seen the incredible progress that Estonia has made. And he introduced this notion of mutual reciprocity in blockchain systems like this, where we should have the right to see certain information, transparency in what you can see, but also the person who controls the data should know who's viewing that information. And I think that's a fundamental system, and it's a fundamental design feature of blockchain that could be so incredibly helpful and effective, as you mentioned, for supply chains.
Well, Michael, even to add to that, focusing on the private sector, as you know, I'm a farm kid from the South, so agriculture is important to me. And when you look at what has become extremely important to many populations is food sourcing and food safety. And Bill mentioned Walmart. Walmart has been a true leader in both of those areas on not only, where does my food come from, but how is it raised or how is it grown, and what kind of pesticides or insecticide or herbicides have been used in the growing of that food. And I think both the sourcing and the safety, how many times and years in a row do we have to see farmers devastated in areas which have a salmonella outbreak, and tens of thousands of acres of farmers' crops are destroyed because they can't locate the source and pinpoint it And we all know how effective blockchain technology is in doing just that, in providing the kind of trust that we as consumers expect from our food supply. And that's just another, private sector example of how powerful this technology can be in building trust.
So how, though, do we get, Joe Public to trust it, right? I mean, it seems to me that, what you're alluding to there, Jim, is something that could be, if people can have greater confidence in where things are coming from, it just builds overall trust in the overall system. But to get there, I think, we still have to get our heads around this way of managing things, and whether it is, the general public understanding that this mechanism exists and how it functions, or entities who don't necessarily trust each other having to play a kind of a cooperative, collaborative game inside a decentralized ecosystem that's needed to make all this work. So I was wondering, Nasia, whether you could give us some thoughts on how the rollout of different technologies, not just blockchain and others, what's that done to the general public's understanding in Africa, where we've had, you've mentioned problems with corruption and compliance, but do people feel as if they're getting a better handle on some of these problems because of the introduction of these new technologies?
Yeah, I would say beyond just the specific different technologies, it's just really social media, in its totality, and having access to a smartphone with data, and now you've got knowledge right at your fingertips, and you can tweet the CEO of a company if you are not happy with a product, So what it comes down to, for us here is that because we have such a young population, and obviously a lot of private institutions, companies wouldn't exist if there isn't a public that's going to go out and buy those services or goods, right? So without and if we think about what it really causes a lot of the lack of trust, it's this lack of transparency and the lack of information that goes out to the public. It's very opaque, even with public institutions. Where is all this information sitting? So now with the internet, you can get so much information so quickly, and everybody, ordinary people, can get this information. And so I think for me, especially down here across our continent, the tools are there, the knowledge and the passion is for sure here because the generations are so young. But it still comes down to a lot of our leadership. And if we can make that stretch to say, even CEOs of companies being willing to, do Facebook Live events, being more transparent in their communication, owning up if there has been corruption or mistakes made in public institutions or private institutions. South Africa, we've been fairly transparent around a lot of issues in the government, and that does at least provide the trust. But then there's also the efficiency and inefficiency question that comes with that. So I think really being able to meet the public, at the level where they are, which is a lot through social media, and being transparent in that sort of reaching out and engaging younger people. I think for us that I really see working down here.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Nasia. Jeff, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the Prosperity Collaborative, and I wanted to sort of deal with this in the context of this idea about how do you generate trust amongst the public. We're not going to have institutions however well they're managed. It really also comes down to this relationship, I think some of us have said, with citizens themselves.
Mm.
So, and the Prosperity Collaborative sounds to me is really sort of focused very much on that. Maybe you can elaborate a bit.
I'd love to. And as Jim mentioned, when we look at these issues of governance, we do have some gaps in the world. We realize that EY and many other institutions have realized this. No single institution has all the answers. These are ecosystem problems, and these are ecosystem-based solutions. And so we formed what, Michael, you referred to as a Prosperity Collaborative, is an initiative with EY, the World Bank, MIT, our great partner that we work quite a bit with, MIT, and New America and the Boston Global Forum. We believe that these 5 organizations together have the great credentials to actually develop technology to improve tax and fiscal systems and solving problems with advanced technologies around the world with a focus on emerging markets. The issue we're finding is that it was really hard to develop technology for one client or one customer. Now we want to build it for multiple stakeholders, and we don't have the governance systems in the world to do it. And it was the biggest takeaway this year. We launched the collaborative in Davos alongside the World Economic Forum. Coming out of Davos, it was the number one issue that I took away from Davos this year was the need for governance models around the world to develop the standards and technology that affect multiple stakeholders. We simply don't have those institutions that are ready to do it today. If we learn one thing from the pandemic is that there's a bright light shining on the need for this issue in the world. Somebody has to step up and provide that governance, and we formed the Prosperity Collaborative in an attempt to provide some leadership in that area. And we're really excited to launch it and to try to do some good in the world.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think about, the kinds of challenges that we face in terms of, reaching these standards and coming together around common models. I think in an earlier conversation, Alan, you'd mentioned that, we really, because of this COVID crisis, we are now entering into, essentially the largest global scientific community research undertaking perhaps of all time in terms of how we're going to deal with things like vaccines and so forth, and just public health management as well. How do we get there? How do we get to the point where all of that research, which is happening in a fragmented way for now, becomes, it continues in that almost entrepreneurial way you want it to be, where there's competition and it's all vibrantly driven by multiple players doing their own thing, but is somehow at the same time collectively being optimized for the public good?
So it feels very much like we have the pieces in place, Michael, as you've said. You have scientists all over the world working against the same problems. You have public repositories where scientists can post abstracts and papers of the work that they're doing. And then you have entities from Johns Hopkins University to individual physicians collecting that information and putting it out. So what's the next step? And it makes me think about what you can now do on the website at NOAA or at the National Geological Survey, where you have individuals reporting in, well, I've felt an earthquake here, and I've felt an earthquake here, and it feels this is the severity, and this is this. And you're aggregating information from a wide range of decentralized sources into a picture that everyone can see. So how do we take the next step and say, how can we safely, and in a way that creates and supports, enhances scientific integrity, begin to put the raw information out into, as Bill said, a central reference layer? How can we begin to put that, this was the number of subjects, and this is what we pushed against, and this is what we tried, and this was the result, and anyone can go look. And so you don't have to rely on a media filter to understand whether this study is to be tested or this study is not. These people are being dishonest. These people are the ones you should listen to. You can go see for yourself. And that's difficult. We have the pieces. We have the informational pieces. We have the desire. We have a community. As in so many things, and Jeff, I think, put his finger on it in this space, the governance layer, the human governance layer, to put on top of that is the problem that we need to solve for. How can we create a place, and to use in Bill's sense, more of a technological place, a cloud environment, a data environment, in which, on the one hand, we can get the creators of information not only to feel comfortable posting their information, which they do, but to be able to do it in a safe and secure way that preserves the scientific integrity and the privacy of individuals. And then make that available to be tested against not only by other scientists and researchers, but in a way that the general public can look and say, I can cut through the noise of different interpretations and different messages, and just look for myself and see and understand what's going on within this amazing race to understand what's gone on in our world, what's going on with people across the world, and how can we kind of together figure out our path.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the data science aspect of this too, because we've never had more data at our avail and anywhere near the kind of powerful tools we now have for performing the analytics on that. Bill, I want you to weigh in here. You're working with a company that actually is drawing upon data scientists from a firm that actually has a name that would be probably associated more with infamy right now. That's Cambridge Analytica. But the bottom line is that, you know, the tools and the systems that they develop there can be put to good, right? I mean, there's an enormous amount of informational power that can come from that.
No question.
How do you do it in a way that doesn't, to Alan's point, breach privacy and therefore, most importantly, build trust in the system?
You know, it's really a question of what are the data sources and at what application are you pointing? And just to give you a bit of maybe too much information, but a frame of reference. So about 10 years ago, I co-founded a company called Treasure Data. And among our investors were another company that I had seeded called Wish.com, which is just filed to go public. It should come out around 20 billion. But I got the two founders of Wish and the founder of Zoom to back me in Treasure Data. Wish was our first customer. What we did was we basically built a system whereby when you register on Wish.com, you register through Facebook. That single click allowed access for Treasure Data to basically look at your profile and all of the things you liked and, you know, all the kind of the information about you and figure out what products to put on that page. And if you've ever looked at Wish, it looks like Pinterest with a buy button. There's like you'll get served watches and underwear and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, so we were able to steer purchases using data science, collecting the ambient data around a person. Cambridge Analytica's data science team effectively did the identical thing, but instead of steering $10 purchases from China, they steered votes. And, you know, they didn't know how big an impact they were going to have. They were good at data science. They were just getting paid as a, you know, contract to do that. They never thought Trump was going to win, but he did. Anyway, so lots of things happened with Cambridge Analytica after that, and there was questions about, you know, where do they get the data and all that stuff. But long story short, that team was very talented. They know how to look at ambient data and figure out how to distill that ambient data into information that is relevant. And so that's what we're doing. So I basically have written a check to fund the core data science team out of Cambridge Analytica, take them out of personal data, move them up into more B2B industrial data, and start to work on solutions to the same things we talked about earlier. How do you allow any organization in a low friction way to create a digital twin of itself and collect that ambient data, have a machine learning layer that actually understands the organization and what it is, to increase operational efficiency, reduce working capital requirements, allow it to interconnect with other nodes, you know, and law. And I'm not a lawyer, but there are lawyers on this call. You know, law and business entities, it's a really fundamentally interesting concept that businesses are treated as if they were people. They're kind of like it's unique institution, right? So we're basically doing what was done at an individual level, looking at the person in a node and an ocean of people and how they interconnect and what do the connections, what information do the connections imply, and abstracting that to legal entities interconnected all over the world. So it's basically do the same thing over again, but at a higher level to specific objectives of making information relevant to better operational decisions and more trust.
Right. I mean, I think that's probably all we're going to have time for now. I'm just going to leave on that note, because I think you get a couple of words in there that I think are really important, right? The human component of this, the legal entity, which is the institution we're talking about, and then how we bring it all together in a way where the data, the information that is collected across those entities is done in a way to serve the public good. It's this connection between humans, machines, and data that I think is ultimately where we, can leave on an optimistic note, and hopefully we, through this conversation, we've laid the groundwork for something that can move us into a world of greater trust, greater resilience in institutions, and some of this the nightmare of 2020 can be something that we'll learn from rather than just look back as a destructive force. So thank you for this wonderful panel. I would call for a round of applause, and people can do so if they like to, but it's a little hard in the virtual world. So Alan Cohn, Jeff Saviano, Jim Newsom, Bill Ty, and Nasia Seria, thank you very much for your time. I think we just sort of say goodbye.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right, guys. Thanks very much.
Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.